So what I'm going to do in the rest of these lectures is talk through three ideas from books 6 and 7 of the Republic. They're three ways to understand what kind of knowledge of the form of the good is. And incidentally, when we understand what knowledge of the form of the good is, we learn something about what it is to know the forms at all. Because the form of the good is kind of like the ultimate form. It's sort of the highest form of all of the forms. Okay, so there are other forms as well besides the form of the good, but the form of the good is, as it were, the best form, or the sort of form that gives power to all the other forms and everything else that exists. So we're going to learn more about that through these three ways of understanding what the form of the good is, namely the sun analogy, the divided line, and the allegory of the cave, which are presented in these roughly 15 pages from Plato's Republic. So the first passage I want to highlight is presented on the way to Socrates making the sun analogy. This gives us really in just 5 or 6 lines a description of Plato's theory of the forms and his rationale for believing in the forms as he did, or thinking that there must be forms. So Socrates says, we say that there are many beautiful, many good, and many other such things, thereby distinguishing them in words. Glaucon says we do. So we both distinguish beautiful things from non-beautiful things, but we also distinguish each beautiful thing from every other. So I'm not sure exactly which distinction he had in mind, but we do both of those things, right? We both say all of these things are beautiful. They also have differences between one another. We can both group things as similar in one way and notice that they're different in other ways. Okay. So then Glaucon says we do. Socrates says we also say there is a beautiful itself and a good itself. And so in the case of all the things that we posited as many, we reverse ourselves and posit a single form belonging to each. Again, this is aidos. Since we suppose there is a single one and call it what it is. So there the point is, when we group lots of things together as beautiful or as good, we can also notice, once we've done that, we can kind of reverse course and say, well, why have we grouped them all together as the same thing? It must be because they all meet some common standard, or they all match some one common idea, which would be the form or the aidos. And so we can give a name to that form, and we say that is the form of beauty, or the form of horse, or the form of good, etc. Glaucon says that's true. And then Socrates says, and we say that the one class of things and we say that the one class of things is visible but not intelligible, and while the forms are intelligible but not visible. So the point here is we don't see the forms directly. We don't see the beautiful itself. We don't see horse itself, okay? The form of horse itself. We see horses. We see beautiful things. But it's through a process of intellection, not a process of sensation. It's through a process of kind of reflection or thinking that we come to know the beautiful itself, or we come to know the form of horse itself. So identifying the forms or the ideas, the aidos, identifying those things can only come about by some kind of intellectual process or intelligible process, some thinking process, not just by a process of sensation, because sensation will only give us individual things, whereas we need thinking in order to get to the sort of category of the thing, or the kind of idea of the thing. And I've represented this thing I've been talking about in a couple different ways in as simple a diagram as I could imagine here. We have that sort of idea is we have the form of something, and then we have a whole bunch of individual things that we can perceive, see, interact with. And each of those things is as it is on Plato's account because it matches this form. It's actually, as he puts it, like a copy of the form, or he sometimes puts it, each of these individual things is as it is because it participates in the form. But as his student Aristotle points out, he wasn't super clear about what he meant by participates in. So this is a very controversial idea, this idea of the forms. And when we come to Aristotle soon, who was Plato's student, we'll see that Aristotle is very critical of this idea of the forms. And he borrows some things from Plato regarding this kind of idea that there are forms of things. But he also undergoes a major, or proposes a major revision of this idea, because he thinks there are very serious problems with it in the way Plato expressed it. And remember that the way that we come to know the individual things is through sensation, some process of like sensible observation through our eyes, ears, smell, and so on. But the way we come to know the forms is some kind of intellectual process, some kind of cognition or reflection. So this brings us to the first of the three analogies or images that Socrates provides in the Republic to help us understand this idea of the form of the good. And as I said before, this will also clarify how forms in general work and how they're supposed to be related to the rest of what we experience. So Socrates starts out by saying, isn't it interesting if you look at sight as a sense, and you look at sight as a sense, we have both sight, the sort of capacity to see, or the experience, or the event of seeing, and we have the thing seen, we have the object, the thing that's seen by them, just like we do with other senses. We have our sense of hearing, we have the kind of event of hearing, but then we also have things heard. We have the objects of hearing, okay, the things that hearing hears. So what Socrates says is, if we look at sight, it doesn't actually see things all on its own. It's not that sight is capable of accessing the thing seen without any intermediaries. In fact, it needs one intermediary very importantly. It needs one kind of helper or something in between it and the thing seen in order for the thing seen to be able to be seen. And that thing that it needs is light. Without light, sight is not able to see the things that it sees. But this light, in turn, isn't just there. It's not that light is, omnipresent. Light comes from somewhere, and Socrates points out it comes characteristically from the sun. And so you might say, well, couldn't light come from other places, fire, a flashlight, etc., right? It could, but I think Socrates is trying to point to a very common experience, which is that we see things, we see them because of light. And where does most of the light that we experience in our lives or in existence come from on Earth? It comes from the sun. And even by a kind of extension, you could say, like, well, energy, even fossil fuel energy, comes from that powers our electrical lighting, comes from fossilized plants and animals. Those have themselves come from ultimately from plants that were eaten by the animals, or from plants themselves, which are powered by the sun. So you could say, even in that case, the light in a way can be traced back to the sun. The sun is like a source of energy on Earth, and so it's a source of even artificial light on Earth. But that's kind of like giving a modern justification for this, which is maybe not necessary. The sort of main point here is that if you just think about the kind of everyday experience, particularly an everyday experience in ancient Greece, most of the light that enables people to see things is going to come from the sun. And at this point, Socrates proposes an analogy. He says, let's think of the relation between sight and the thing seen, and the sun contributing to that as basically an analog of the relation between knowledge, the things that knowledge knows, and the form of the good. So the form of the good is like the sun in that it provides the light that allows knowledge to know the things that it knows. So you can meditate on that for a little bit. Think about that. The form of the good, the form of goodness. So it's the form, again, what Plato has called a kind of source or eternal model for every instance of the thing that we experience. Now, this is the form of the good. So every good thing we experience, every experience of something good, or every thing that we consider good, is going to somehow be a copy of this form of the good. And this form of the good, Socrates is now saying, is like the sun in that it is what enables knowledge to know the things known. So I'll let you meditate on that a little bit and think whether you think that's true. Would it be possible to know things without the participation of, or the somehow the involvement of, this kind of eternal standard of better and worse? This eternal standard of goodness. Is it possible to know things without any concern or knowledge of goodness, without any involvement of a distinction between better and worse? Or is knowing things at all itself dependent in some sense? Like light, just like sight is dependent on light, that is it the case that knowledge of things is dependent in some sense on a distinction between better and worse? So one way to make sense